Thank you, Jonathan, for those very kind words of introduction. I just must say that your introductions throughout this conference have been exemplary. The only thing is that they pose an immense challenge to the speakers to somehow be able to respond to the natures of those introductions. But I take them as being, in my case, the excesses of friendship. But thank you for those kind words. We meet at an important moment in the struggle, what I would call the struggle against the Iranian five-fold threat: the nuclear threat, the terrorist threat, the hegemonic threat, the incitement threat, and the massive domestic repression. Regrettably, the negotiation process itself, of the P5+1 to arrive at the nuclear deal, not only overshadowed, but sanitized the other four threats. And as we meet today, as I say, we meet at an important moment because Congress is also reconvening now to consider the Iranian agreement. While clearly there are not enough votes to override a veto, there are and is enough support with respect to ensuring that the agreement itself, which has been arrived at, will be enforced and effectively implemented. There is also support for doing exactly what President Obama has always said and repeatedly said is his ongoing objective, which is, as he put it again and again, to prevent Iran from ever becoming a nuclear power. And he would say, I repeat, my policy and the policy of my administration is prevention, not containment. Iran will never be allowed to become a nuclear power. Yet this agreement, regrettably, given the manifold loopholes in this agreement, may very well, as many of its critics have said, actually pave the way in terms of pathways to a nuclear weapon in a variety of ways, and may therefore, in fact, end up effectively contradicting the very undertaking that the President said, and which finds expression in the preamble to the agreement, but not the agreement itself. And so the question is, what can be done? But before I go to that question, because I suspect that as the debate reconvenes in Congress, we may be hearing some of the noises that we heard during the summer that tend to block out the appropriate understanding of the agreement. Let me say that I sometimes find that some of the critics of the agreement have themselves used language inappropriate with respect to those who ended up supporting a position that I do not support, namely as Congressman Nadler, who said after considered discussion and appreciation and analysis of the agreement, with all its flaws, he has decided to support it. He then was referred to, and I was present at some public demonstrations where this occurred, as a capo and the like. That type of characterization has no place with respect to this agreement. But that came from rabble-rousers in the crowds. That came from some inappropriate advertisement. But some of the noises that came from the administration were, because they came from administration officials, more disturbing. I'm referring to reference to the fact that those who are critics of this agreement or who are voting against this agreement prefer the military option over the negotiation option, or that they are warmongers, or that they supported the Iraq war, or that they are simply Republicans and the like. Let me say at the outset and make full disclosure. I speak before you as what would be called in parallel Canadian terms as a liberal Democrat. I speak as someone who in the Canadian Parliament voted against the Iraq War, unlike some of the officials in the Obama administration who supported the Iraq War, like Senator Kerry himself, like Vice President Biden himself. That's fine. I don't make any critique of their support of that war, but I don't think it is appropriate to thereby characterize those who oppose this agreement as somehow preferring the military option over the diplomatic option, or as being warmongers, or even engaging in language that elicits the old double loyalty trope, and we had too much of that, and some of it even found expression after Senator Schumer said that he would, in fact, oppose this agreement. So I'm hoping the discussion can take place outside the atmospherics which clouded the discussions before. And what I would like to do now, in the time remaining, are two things. Number one, to suggest what needs to be done to make the agreement that I felt was a bad agreement, how we can at least make this agreement an effective agreement, even on its own terms, to see that it is effectively implemented. And also to make some suggestions about some prospective amendments that can be made without having to renegotiate the agreement or open it up for discussion, but amendments along the same lines of the President's own commitment, which he said underscored this agreement, namely that this will prevent Iran from ever becoming a nuclear state. And so, in that regard, I will make some suggestions about what needs to be done to both enforce the agreement and amend it without having to renegotiate it, number one. Number two, because I believe that the agreement itself has overshadowed the other four threats, to make some reference to what needs to be done with regard to two of those threats. As I mentioned, other threats are the terrorist threat, the hegemonic threat, the incitement threat, and the human rights massive domestic repression. As this conference yesterday, and I suspect otherwise, has considered the danger posed by Iran as the leading global state sponsor of international terrorism, and has otherwise considered the hegemonic dimensions of the Iranian threat, I will focus only on the other two threats, which have regrettably been ignored in terms of remedies for those two threats. I'm speaking here about the incitement threat and the human rights domestic repression. Much of what I'm saying is anchored in the Iran Accountability Week, which has been an annual inquiry that our Canadian Parliament has held for the last 4 years. It's actually 2 weeks, where we deliberate in the form of having a parliamentary inquiry into the Iranian fivefold threat, where we have a global Iranian political prisoner advocacy project in which Canadian parliamentarians are matched with Iranian political prisoners and undertake their case and cause, whereby we have and have approved a 15-point action plan with respect to addressing and sanctioning Iranian human rights violations, and where we've made express recommendations with regard to what can be done from a juridical point of view, to counter the Iranian incitement. I want to say that countering Iranian incitement, as I will get to in a few moments, is not a policy option. It is an international legal obligation. The Genocide Convention, which we sometimes forget and often ignore, expressly prohibits, and I repeat, expressly prohibits incitement to genocide. The very incitement constitutes the crime. In a recent Supreme Court judgment, the Supreme Court of Canada, in a case involving incitement by a Rwandan who sought refugee status in Canada and who initially got refugee status, and it arrived in 1992, and the case was being considered in 2005 because through our appellate procedures it went on. His defense was, I came to Canada in 2002. I got refugee status then. The Rwandan genocide occurred in 1994. How can I be accused, let alone convicted, of something that took place after I left Rwanda? And the court held that the mere incitement to genocide, not mere, that the incitement to genocide, and found out that he had been engaged in repeated and systematic incitement to genocide through the Radio Colline in Rwanda in 1992, in and of itself constitutes the crime, whether or not genocidal consequences follow. So when you have Khamenei, I'm not speaking about Ahmadinejad, who was doing all those years, but when you have Khamenei beginning the 21st century on January 3rd, 2000, saying there can be no solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state, in this instance, not even the Zionist regime or the Zionist entity or other terms. And then repeatedly invoke the imperative of excising this cancerous tumor, Israel, from the Middle East. And I can go on and on. I wouldn't want to bore or burden you, though it should alarm us. Yet no legal initiatives were undertaken to combat it, though, as I said, this is not a policy option. It is an international obligation on the part of the world community. So let me now turn to the agreement itself, as I said in my first part, what needs to be done, and then thereafter look at the other two areas in which I think we should address. But what I found intriguing as we look at the agreement was not only what Obama said, but what Rouhani said about the agreement. And I just want to reference you some things he said, because I think they really build into what needs to be addressed. And here is Irani saying that all their goals have been achieved with regard to the agreement. And I quote, on the matter of the centrifuges, he said, at the start of the negotiations, the other side would tell us that during the period of restrictions, which today is set at 8 years in the beginning, Iran could have only 100 centrifuges. After many deliberations, they arrived at 1,000. Because of great opposition on our part, they said 4,000, and that this would never change. Today, the agreement carried out states that Iran will retain over 6,000 centrifuges, over 5,000 of which will be at Natanz and over 1,000 at Fordo. All centrifuges at Natanz will continue to enrich uranium. He might have added that, in fact, the initial Obama position was that Iran would not be permitted to enrich uranium. That, in fact, had been embedded in UN Security Council resolutions, 6 of them, that the US had itself initiated to its credit. We have even gone far away from that undertaking against the very enrichment of uranium. That fell very early in the negotiating process. A second thing, on the issue of research and development, here again, President Rouhani, they, referring to the United States, would say that only first-generation IR-1 centrifuges would be allowed. This was ridiculous and unrealistic. Research and development in this situation is meaningless. Then they said IR-2 at most. We wanted an agreement, and these are the crucial words, under which, on the day of its implementation, we would begin to inject gas into advanced IR-8 centrifuges, and that is exactly what we have achieved in this agreement. On the heavy water reactor at Iraq, Again, Rouhani. On this issue, the Americans would say the reactor will remain, but the heavy water facility is null. On and on. At the end of the day, as he puts it, this reactor will be completed, this is Rouhani, with the same heavy water nature and with the characteristics noted in this agreement. One last thing, because as I say, each one of these things highlights and dramatizes the serious flaws in this agreement. In the matter of Fordo, they would say, this is Rouhani, it is hard to pronounce the name Fordo, and it is even harder to hear it, so you will not say it, and we will not hear it. Then they said, referring to the P5+1, at Fordo there will not be one centrifuge, and it will be a center only for isotope research. After months of talks, they said, only one cascade of 164 centrifuges. I will be brief and say that today over 1,000 centrifuges will be installed at Fordo, and part of Fordo will be used for research and development, and we know the aftermath with that regard. I could continue and almost go and take up your time with regard to the entire Rouhani characterization of the agreement, and frankly, every one of the things he says is correct. Each one of the things the Americans initially held out to be a red line, whether it would be the enrichment of uranium or the number of centrifuges or the use of advanced centrifuges and the like, each red line became, as I said in another connection, Syria at the time, a pink advisory, and at the end of the day, all red lines were violated. And so what then needs to be done? I have set forth elsewhere, and for reasons of time, I'm going to seek to be brief on this, some 10 recommendations as to what needs to be done in this period of congressional discussion. Some of these recommendations include, for example, that we need to know what has been referred to in the language, the possible PMDs, the possible military dimensions of Iran's prior nuclear research and weaponization program. Unless this is known, you have no baseline for knowing how we are, where we are, and how we got there, and what needs to be done. Iran undertook in discussions with the International Atomic Energy Agency to make disclosure with respect to these PMDs. Regrettably, it has not made such disclosure, and then Senator Kerry, when asked about the fact that Iran is not making disclosure, said, well, we know everything that they are doing. But in fact, we don't know everything that they were doing, and the whole purpose of the undertaking with regard to disclosure on the military dimensions is so that we would not only know what in fact they did in the past at Fordo and Natanz and elsewhere, and Rouhani in another connection said, while we were talking, this is during the 2003, 2004 discussions, during which time the PMD work was carried out. He said, while we were talking, we were also advancing at Natanz and Fordo. We need to know what was going on then in order to appreciate where we are now. And this goes into the second point, and that is the matter of inspections, where the American position would be inspections anytime, anywhere. We now have, as you know, a very complicated and somewhat convoluted, protracted process with regard to the inspections. We need to go back and have an agreement which initially was intended to have an intrusive and comprehensive approach to inspections, because when Obama again said here, we will not trust, but we will verify, you cannot verify under the present protracted regime where Iran not only has 24 days, but in a whole set of delays built into it. We simply do not have a comprehensive, intrusive, effective inspections regime. And without inspections, you can't verify. and without verification, you can't enforce this agreement. So this is a second dimension. A third has to be that we go back with respect to the caps that were intended to be on both the number of centrifuges and on the quality of centrifuges, and in fact ensure that there is not, although this agreement leaves in place a nuclear infrastructure, that it will not leave in place a nuclear infrastructure which will become effectively radioactive. I see from the time that I'm moving to a close, so let me just make some reference in the matter of the juridical remedies to combat incitement. I'm using the term juridical remedies because I want to make it clear that what I'm proposing here are really the implementation of obligations under the Genocide Convention. Now, the Iranian regime's criminal incitement in violation of the Genocide Convention, I said, has long been documented. An all-party report by the Canadian Parliament in the course of our Iran Accountability Week found, and I quote, "Iran has already committed the crime of incitement to genocide prohibited under the Genocide Convention." Already committed the crime, and was documented in our parliamentary report. Yet, as we meet, not one state, not the United States, not any of the other countries under the P5+1 agreement, not even my own country, Canada, after a unanimous finding by our parliamentary report, not one state party to the Genocide Convention has undertaken any of the mandated responsibilities to prevent and punish such incitement. Such remedies include, and I close, number one, referring this genocidal incitement to the UN Security Council for accountability and sanction. As we meet, no request has ever been made by any state party to the Genocide Convention to the UN Security Council to consider this sustained incitement that continues and in fact even intensified after the agreement is signed. Two, initiating an interstate complaint against Iran, which is also a state party to the Genocide Convention and is sometimes forgotten, before the International Court of Justice for its standing violation of this prohibition under the Genocide Convention. I'm not saying that such a complaint will in fact succeed, but the fact that no state has ever even initiated such a complaint tells us something about the manner in which not only Iran is relieved of its accountability in this regard, but the disregard of the state parties for the seriousness of its international obligations, which has implications for the larger context of the nuclear agreement. Third, calling upon the UN Secretary General to refer the situation in Iran to the UN Security Council as one that threatens international peace and security pursuant to Article 99 of the UN Charter. This is something for which the Secretary General is often using the Article 99 with respect to such situations, yet no reference of this kind can do it. I can go on with other remedies, but simply put, this panoply of juridical remedies, which has brought about the indictment of other dictators in other contexts before the courts and the like, should be added to the existing political, diplomatic, and economic sanctions that are needed to sanction Iran's nuclear weaponization program, to sanction its global terrorism activities, its belligerence, and the like. And on the human rights front, I'll make only one recommendation, again, going from our report, we made 15. One was, and it's shocking that this has not yet been done, the Minister of Justice under the Rouhani administration, Mr. Puhamadi, is the one responsible for the executions of thousands of Iranian dissidents back in the late 80s. Yet he was rewarded for that criminality by being appointed by the moderate Rouhani as Minister of Justice. I say this because as we meet, Iran, and this has been going on in particular during the negotiation of this agreement, Iran has escalated its executions to the point where not only was it the country that executed more people under judicial authority than any other country in the world in its illegal exercise of that authority, but under Rouhani, the rate of executions has doubled. And the Minister of Justice and other officials responsible for that continue to operate with immunity and with impunity. They need to be officials singled out for sanctions under a human rights accountability regime, just as the incitement remedies need to hold them accountable for breaches of the genocide conventions, and the nuclear agreement itself, where they convene today, must be enforced effectively under the terms that they themselves, which are flawed, but under the terms that they themselves contain, and more importantly, should be effectively amended so that some 10 major flaws that many of us have described elsewhere can be addressed and redressed. It's not too late to do so. The hour may be late, but the urgency for purposes of international peace and security remains. Thank you.